The Grand Conclave of the Ethelgardian High Synod was not designed for silence, yet silence was the heaviest thing within it. The chamber was a colossal geode of polished obsidian and singing crystal, a structure grown rather than built, suspended in the null-gravity heart of Station 012. Usually, this hall thrummed with the subsonic harmonies of the Lithos diplomats or the chittering, frantic bargaining of the insectoid Vex. Today, the air was stagnant, tasting of recycled oxygen and the copper tang of fear. The galaxy was holding its breath, and the exhalation when it came would be fire. High Counselor Xyler, a being of slender, elongated limbs and bioluminescent skin that currently pulsed a dull, anxious gray, gripped the edges of the podium. His large, dark eyes swept over the assembly, observing the terrified representatives of 100 worlds. They were waiting for the end. The Krail hegemony had arrived. Their fleets did not obscure the stars, they replaced them. A tapestry of jagged metal and fusion drives now surrounded the neutral station, a blockade that defied logic in its sheer scale. There were no demands for negotiation, no diplomatic hails, only a singular loop transmission that had been broadcasting for 3 standard cycles. Submit or extinguish. It was the binary choice of a species that had long ago discarded the concept of mercy in favor of efficiency. Xyler's gaze drifted from the terrified holographic displays of the approaching Krail armada to the viewport that dominated the southern curve of the hall. There, floating in the void, starkly illuminated by the station's floodlights, was the anomaly. It was the reason the humans were here, and the subject of much derision in the cycles leading up to this catastrophe. It was a ship, or what remained of one. The humans called it the CNS Ozymandias. To the Ethelgard and the rest of the galactic conquered, it was a joke. A rust-streaked, blocky, unaerodynamic slab of primitive titanium and ceramic composites. It lacked the elegant curves of Ethelgardian void sailors or the terrifying, spiked silhouettes of Krail dreadnoughts. It looked like a brick thrown through a glass window. The humans insisted it was a museum ship, a traveling exhibition of their pre-FTL history, touring the galaxy to foster cultural understanding. The Synod had allowed it to dock only out of pity for the young, seemingly harmless species. Now, as the Krail prepared to turn the station into radioactive dust, the presence of the floating museum felt like a grim punchline. The humans were going to die beside their own history, entombed in a relic that couldn't even power its own engines without a tug drone. The Krail High Marshal demands a response within the hour, the Vex representative clicked, its mandibles twitching in a nervous rhythm that grated on Xyler's auditory receptors. We must surrender the station. We must open the airlocks. Perhaps they will take us as laborers. Extinction is absolute. Slavery is temporary. A murmur of agreement rippled through the hall. Survival was the primary instinct of the conquered. Honor was a luxury afforded only to those with superior firepower. Xyler looked toward the human delegation. They sat apart from the others, a small group of 3 individuals clad in dark, formal fabric that absorbed the ambient light. They were not panicking. They were not checking data slates for escape trajectories. They were simply watching. The leader of the human delegation, a woman with silver hair and eyes that looked like chipped flint, sat with her hands folded on the table. Her name was Ambassador Thorn. She had not spoken since the blockade began. Her silence was infuriating. It was the silence of the ignorant, Xyler concluded. They did not understand the magnitude of the Krail. They thought their diplomatic immunity, or perhaps their novelty, would save them. They were wrong. Ambassador Thorn, Xyler said, his voice amplified by the crystalline acoustics of the chamber. The Synod is preparing to draft a surrender. We advise you to signal your vessel. The Krail may view it as debris and destroy it simply to clear their firing lines. If you evacuate your crew to the station immediately, we can include you in the surrender terms. It is the only logic that remains. The hall turned its collective attention to the humans. The disdain was palpable. Here stood the masters of the galaxy, the Ethelgard with their psionic architecture, the Vex with their hypermining, the fluidic Oysir with their mastery of genetics, all trembling before the Krail. And here sat the humans, possessing nothing but a rusted hulk filled with plaques and statues, looking bored. Thorn stood up slowly. Her movement was not fluid like the Oysir, nor jerky like the Vex. It was deliberate, solid. She adjusted the cuffs of her jacket and looked up at the podium, her expression unreadable. High Counselor, Thorn began, her voice low but carrying a resonank. That cut through the ambient hum of the life support systems. The Ozymandias is not debris, and we will not be evacuating. We have reviewed the Krail transmission. We find their terms unacceptable. A sound between a gasp and a laugh fluttered through the assembly. Unacceptable. The Krail did not ask for acceptance. They dealt in physics, in the kinetic energy of railguns and the thermal bloom of plasma. To find them unacceptable was like finding a supernova inconvenient. "You are young to the galactic stage, human," Xyler said, pity mixing with his terror. "You do not know the Krail, they do not bluff, they do not trade, they are a tide of iron, your ship is a museum, it contains displays of what? Primitive projectile throwers, combustion engines, written paper. It is a tomb for a memory, do not make it a tomb for your people." Thorn looked out the viewport at the hulking, ugly shape of the Ozymandias. For a moment, a strange softness touched her face, a look of profound sorrow, before it hardened back into granite. "It is a museum," she agreed. "It holds the history of our species, the era of fragmentation, the Silicon Wars, the unification. It holds the memory of every mistake we ever made." She turned back to Xyler. "But you misunderstand the nature of human history, High Counselor. We do not keep it to remember how we lived. We keep it to remember how we survived, and we never throw anything away." The ominous ambiguity of her statement hung in the air, baffling the aliens. Before Xyler could respond, the station shuddered. The lights flickered and turned a deep blood red. The proximity alarms began to scream, a discordant shriek that signaled the end of diplomacy. The Krail had grown tired of waiting. "They have fired," the tactical officer shouted from the pit below the podium. "Kinetic bombardment. Impact in 40 seconds. Shields are failing. The blockade has launched boarding pods. They aren't just destroying us, they are taking the station." Chaos erupted. Dignitaries scrambled for the exits, trampling one another in a futile rush toward escape pods that had likely already been targeted. Xyler stood frozen, watching the holographic doom approach. The Krail ships were unleashing a storm of metal, slugs the size of buildings accelerated to a fraction of light speed. The station's shields were paper against a hurricane. Through the panic, Xyler saw Thorn touch a small, antiquated communication device at her ear. She spoke one word softly, but in the acoustic perfection of the hall, Xyler heard it. "Awake." The view outside the viewport shifted. The Ozymandias, the rusted, silent block of iron, did not move. It did not fire engines. It did not raise shields of energy that glowed blue or gold like the conquered vessels. Instead, it simply changed. The rust, which the aliens had assumed was the decay of centuries, began to bleed away like mist in a gale. Underneath the illusion of corrosion, the hull was not gray, but a black so profound it seemed to drink the light of the nearby stars. It was a matte, abyssal darkness, a void given form. The clunky, blocky aesthetic remained, but now it didn't look primitive, it looked brutalist. It looked like a fortress built to endure the death of a sun. A vibration, deep and resonant, began to hum through the floor of the station, felt in the bones rather than heard. It wasn't the station's reactor. It was coming from the Ozymandias. The museum was powering up. But it wasn't the gentle hum of a fusion drive. It was the roar of a contained singularity. The sensors on the tactical deck began to scream, not with warnings of impact, but with errors. They were detecting energy spikes that defied the standard models of physics. Gravitational lensing began to warp the starlight around the human ship. "What is that?" Xyler whispered, his terror momentarily eclipsed by confusion. "What is that energy signature?" Thorn remained standing, her eyes fixed on the encroaching Krail fleet. "That," she said, "is the exhibit from Hall 4, the Alcubierre node smasher. We banned it 300 years ago because it tore holes in the fabric of causality, but it's very effective at crowd control." The first volley of Krail kinetic slugs reached the perimeter of the Ozymandias. They did not bounce off shields. They did not explode against armor. They simply vanished. The space around the human ship had become a distortion field, a localized gravity well that chewed matter into subatomic paste. The slugs were atomized instantly, their kinetic energy fed into the ship's capacitors. Then the Ozymandias spoke. It was not a radio transmission. It was a broadcast on all frequencies, analog and digital, psychic and sonic. It was a roar of white noise that coalesced into a voice, synthetic yet terrifyingly human. "Designation, battleship, protocol, endurance, intervention authorized." The museum designation was gone. The camouflage was dropped. The ship began to move, not with the grace of an engine, but with the violence of a displacement. It put itself between the station and the Krail fleet. The Krail, unused to resistance, paused for a microsecond, a fatal error. They scanned the vessel, expecting a standard conquered warship. What they found was a nightmare of density. The human ship was not built of standard alloys. It was constructed of collapsed matter, plates of neutronium-laced steel that weighed more than a small moon. It was an immovable object. The Krail flagship, the World Breaker, fired its main plasma lance. The beam, hot enough to core a planet, struck the Ozymandias. The station's inhabitants shielded their eyes, expecting the human ship to vaporize. When the light faded, the black ship remained. The hull glowed a dull cherry red for a moment before venting the heat into space in a massive, shimmering plume of radiator fluid. It had taken the hit. It had absorbed the wrath of an empire and merely gotten warm. Inside the conclave, silence returned, but this time it was the silence of awe. Thorn tapped her comms again. "Curator, you have permission to access the Forbidden Archives." On the bridge of the Ozymandias, a room that looked less like a cockpit and more like a cathedral of analog dials and manual switches, Captain Elias Thorn, Thorn's father, cracked his knuckles. He was an old man, his spine bent, his hands covered in liver spots, but his eyes were sharp. He looked at the young crew around him, historians and archaeologists who had signed up to polish plaques, now strapped into combat shock frames. "All right, kids," Elias rasped. "Lesson number 1. The galaxy thinks we're peaceful because we're polite. They forgot that we wrote the book on war before we learned to write poetry." He reached for a heavy, red lever that had been sealed behind glass labeled in case of apocalypse. He shattered the glass with the butt of a magnetic pistol. "Let's show them why we retired this old girl." He pulled the lever. The Ozymandias did not fire lasers. Lasers were for precision. Humans in their oldest, darkest wars did not care for precision. The ship deployed its physical batteries. Along the flanks of the massive vessel, hundreds of airlocks blew open. From the depths of the museum halls, massive cannons emerged. These were not energy weapons. They were rail drivers, mass drivers, macro cannons that fired physical shells the size of shuttlecraft. The ammunition was not explosive. It was density-collapsed waste matter, depleted uranium, and tungsten rods. It was brute force weaponized. The ship turned into a porcupine of fire. The recoil was so immense that the artificial gravity on the station O12 fluctuated. Krail fleet, shielded against energy weapons and plasma, was unprepared for the sheer kinetic violence of humanity's past. The shells didn't care about dispersion fields. They punched through shields through sheer momentum. They smashed into the ornate, spiky hulls of the Krail ships and shattered them. It was like watching a sledgehammer hit a crystal vase. The World Breaker took a hit to its bridge, a solid slug of iron moving at .1 light speed. The flagship didn't explode, it crumpled. The back broke. The engines flared and died. Back in the conclave, Xyler was trembling. "Projectile weapons," he stammered. "You are using bullets against the Krail?" Thorn nodded slowly. "Energy can be dispersed, frequencies can be jammed, but Sir Isaac Newton is the deadliest son of a bitch in space. Mass times acceleration, it's a universal language." She watched the screen as a swarm of Krail fighters tried to swarm the human ship. The Ozymandias responded by venting its atmosphere, not accidentally but tactically. A cloud of supercooled gas and shrapnel, literally the gift shop merchandise, millions of commemorative coins and metal statues, was blasted out at explosive velocity. The Krail fighters flew into a wall of high-velocity debris. They were shredded. "That," Thorn noted dryly, "was the souvenir shop. I believe we just sold out." The Krail were panicking now. Their formation broke. They had never fought a rock. They had fought duelists, fencers, energy wielders. They had never fought a brawler that didn't care if it got hit, a brawler that hit back with the weight of a planet. But the Krail were numerous. Hundreds of ships poured fire into the Ozymandias. The black hull was beginning to pit, to crater. Armor plates the size of cities were sloughing off, revealing the skeletal superstructure beneath. "She can't hold forever," Xyler said, finding his voice. "There are too many of them." "She doesn't have to," Thorn said. "She just has to hold their attention." She looked at the sensor readings. The Ozymandias was charging something else. Deep in the belly of the ship, in the hall-marked pre-unification atrocities, a drive core that had been illegal for 1,000 years was spinning up. It was the Hades drive. It didn't move the ship through space. It moved space through the ship. It was a weapon of terror, designed to broadcast a psionic scream, a feedback loop of pure, distilled aggression recorded from the minds of dying soldiers in a forgotten war. It was psychological warfare on a galactic scale. "Curator, activate the Echo," Thorn ordered. On the ship, Elias gritted his teeth. "This is going to hurt," he muttered. He turned the key. The Ozymandias emitted a pulse. It wasn't visible light. It was a mental shockwave. Every sentient being in the sector felt it. The Ethel Guard, with their sensitive telepathy, screamed and clutched their heads. The Krail, bred for aggression, froze. They didn't feel pain. They felt fear. Primal, ancient, mammalian fear. The fear of the dark, of the predator in the cave, of the fire that burns the forest. The humans had weaponized their own evolutionary trauma. For a species like the Krail, who had genetically edited out fear eons ago, the sudden reintroduction of it was paralyzing. Their tactical networks crashed as operators went catatonic. Their fire discipline vanished. What is this?" Xyler gasped, nose bleeding from the psychic pressure. "It is the sound of our history," Thorne said softly, her own face pale. "We carry the ghosts of billions of wars in our genes, High Counselor. We built this ship to contain them. When you attack a museum, you don't just fight the caretakers, you fight the memories." The paralysis of the Krail fleet was the opening. The Ozymandias, smoking, bleeding atmosphere and half-wrecked, rammed the second-largest Krail vessel. It was a maneuver of suicidal insanity. The human ship sheared through the alien dreadnought, its reinforced prow acting as a guillotine. The Krail fleet, terrified, leaderless, and facing a monster that refused to die, broke. They rooted. The invincible armada turned and fled into the dark, chased by the laughter of the railguns. The silence that followed the battle was different. It was the silence of a graveyard, but also the silence of reverence. The Ozymandias drifted near the station, a wreck. Fires burned in its open decks. It looked more like a piece of junk now than it ever had. But no one in the Synod laughed. No one called it a relic. Xyler looked at Thorne with a mixture of terror and gratitude. The hierarchy of the galaxy had shifted in an hour. The harmless historians were the owners of the biggest stick in the yard. "The Krail have retreated," the tactical officer whispered, as if afraid to break the spell. "We are safe." Thorne exhaled a long, shuddering breath. She sat down, suddenly looking very tired. "Good. Tell the curator to vent the heat sinks and prepare for damage control. And tell him the exhibits are safe." Xyler approached the human table cautiously. "Ambassador, that ship, the technology, the Echo, if you possess such power, why do you hide it? Why pretend to be weak? You could rule the Synod, you could dominate the sector." Thorne looked at the alien, her eyes sad. "Rule, dominate, that is Krail thinking, High Counselor. That is the thinking that built the Ozymandias in the first place. We built that ship when we were like them. We conquered, we burned worlds, we almost destroyed ourselves. We hid those weapons not to trick you, but to protect ourselves from them. We put them in a museum to say, never again. We wanted to be explorers, artists, diplomats. We wanted to leave the sword in the stone." She gestured to the smoking wreck of the ship. "We didn't want to be warriors anymore, but you didn't give us a choice." The implications hung heavy in the air. The humans were not peaceful because they were weak. They were peaceful because they were good at war and they hated it. They had chosen restraint, and the galaxy had mistaken restraint for incapacity. Hours turned into cycles. The station crews worked alongside the humans to repair the Ozymandias. The cultural exchange was no longer one of condescension, but of intense curiosity and wary respect. The Krail defeat had sent shockwaves through the galaxy. The hegemony was fracturing, its vassals rebelling now that the myth of Krail invincibility was broken. But amidst the celebration, a shadow remained. The Ozymandias had not just fought a battle, it had done something else. During the height of the conflict, when the Hades drive was active and the reality-distorting shields were up, the ship's ancient sensors designed to look for threats far older than the Krail, had picked up a signal. Captain Elias Thorne stood in the ruins of the bridge. The air smelled of burnt wiring and ozone. He was looking at a specific monitor, one that was isolated from the ship's main network. It displayed a waveform. It was a repeating pattern, complex, structured, and artificial. It was coming from the intergalactic void, from the dark space between galaxies where nothing should exist. Ambassador Thorne arrived via shuttle, stepping through the debris of the airlock. She found her. "They're staring at the screen." "Damage report," she asked softly. "Structural integrity at 40%, Elias grunted. "Main railguns are fused. The Echo drive is burnt out. She'll never fight again, Alara. She really is a museum piece now." He didn't look away from the screen. "We saved the station. We saved the Synod," Alara Thorne said. "It was worth it." "Was it?" Elias tapped the screen. "Look at this." Alara leaned in. The waveform was pulsing. "What is it? Krail reinforcements?" "No," Elias said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The Krail, they were running. We thought they were expanding, conquering, but look at their trajectory over the last 10 cycles. They weren't invading, they were fleeing." Alara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the life support failure. Fleeing from what? "From this," Elias pointed to the signal. "The Ozymandias was built for the Silicon Wars, yes, but the sensors, the Deep Watch protocols, they were installed later, after we found the ruins on Mars, after we learned that we weren't the first ones here." He looked at his daughter, his eyes haunted. "The Ozymandias is a museum, Alara, but do you know what the centerpiece of the collection is? It's not the guns, it's not the drive." He keyed a command. A holographic map of the galaxy appeared. A red darkness was encroaching on the outer rim, the sector the Krail had just abandoned. "The centerpiece," Elias said, "is the warning this ship wasn't just a weapon, it was a listening post, and it just heard something. The Krail are just the first wave of refugees. The door to the bridge opened, and High Counselor Xyler entered, flanked by 2 Oysir guards. He looked different now, humbled, respectful. "Ambassador, Captain," he bowed. "The Synod wishes to honor you. We are ready to discuss the alliance you proposed. We are ready to listen to the history of humanity." Alara Thorne looked at the alien, then at the red darkness on the map, then at the broken, magnificent ship around her. The war with the Krail was over. But the war, the real war, the one the ancient humans had feared enough to build a monster like the Ozymandias, was just beginning. The museum was closed. The barracks were open. "High Counselor," Alara said, her voice steady, possessing the calm authority of a species that had looked into the abyss and survived. "Gather the Synod. We have much to discuss. And we are going to need more ships, not just yours, ours. We are going to need to open the rest of the museums." Xyler tilted his head. "There are more." Alara smiled, a grim, humorless expression that promised violence and salvation in equal measure. "The Ozymandias is a destroyer, Counselor, but the CNS Oblivion, the Oblivion is a carrier, and she's docked at Jupiter." The scope of the revelation silenced the alien. The humans were not just a single old man and a rusted ship. They were the custodians of an arsenal that could challenge the gods, and they were waking it up. The galaxy had underestimated humanity because they were quiet. They failed to realize that the most dangerous things in the universe are not the ones that roar, but the ones that wait. The Ozymandias hummed a broken, victorious song. Deep in its core, the data from the unknown signal was already being analyzed, encrypted, and sent to Saul. The sleeping giants of Earth were stirring. The museum age was over. The age of reclamation had begun. The weeks following the Battle of Station 012 were a blur of diplomatic upheaval and industrial frenzy. The Galactic Concord, previously a loose coalition of trade agreements and non-aggression pacts, was undergoing a radical metamorphosis. The revelation of Krail vulnerability had shattered the status quo, but the revelation of human capability had rewritten the rulebook. Humanity, once relegated to the children's table of galactic politics, now sat at the head not by demand but by necessity. The Ozymandias remained docked at the station, a shrine of twisted metal and scorched armor. Pilgrims from a dozen species came to see it, the God Killer, they called it. The humans just called it Old Ozzy. But the true work was happening elsewhere. On the station's observation deck, Ambassador Thorne stood with High Exarch Vokrol. The Krail leader was a prisoner of war, though he was not in chains. He stood by the window, staring out at the stars he used to think he owned. He was massive, a hulking creature of chitin and muscle, but his posture was slumped. The psychic shock of the echo had broken something in the Krail psyche, or perhaps it had fixed it. It had reminded them of mortality. "You possess the fire of the ancients," Vokrol rumbled, his voice a grinding tectonic shift. "Why did you not conquer us centuries ago? With one ship you broke our vanguard. With a fleet you could have enslaved the conquered." Thorne sipped her synthesized tea, looking out at the repaired drones swarming the Ozymandias. "We did conquer, Vokrol. We conquered. Earth, then the Sol system, then the local cluster. We conquered until we ran out of enemies, and then we turned on ourselves. We almost burned our cradle to ash. We learned that the power to destroy is easy. Any fool can burn a barn, building a barn that takes effort." "And now," Vokrol asked, "you have shown your sword, you cannot sheath it again. The galaxy fears you." "Good," Thorne said. "Fear creates caution. Caution prevents mistakes, but we don't want you to fear us, Exarch. We want you to fear what's coming." She activated a holographic projector on the table between them. The data Elias had found, the red darkness. It wasn't just a sensor glitch. It was a void swarm, a biological tide moving between galaxies, consuming everything in its path. The Typhon, the great devourer. The ancient enemy that the Krail's ancestors had fled from, a racial memory so suppressed it had manifested as their urge to constantly expand, to run, to militarize. Vokrol stared at the data, his mandibles flared. "The shadow, it is real, the myths of the core worlds." "It's real," Thorne said. "And it's hungry. The Krail weren't expanding for glory, were you? You were building a buffer zone. You were trying to create a fortress galaxy." The Exarch remained silent, the truth of his species laid bare by the human diplomat. They were not conquerors. They were terrified builders trying to wall out the night. "We need the Krail," Thorne said, her voice hard. "We need your fleets, we need your soldiers, but not as masters, as allies. The Ozymandias was a wake-up call. The Oblivion is being reactivated at Jupiter. The Horseman is powering up at Mars. We are bringing the old fleets out of mothballs. But humanity cannot fight the Typhon alone. We are the shield, Vakrul. We need you to be the spear. The alien warlord looked at the small, soft human woman. He saw the steel in her spine, the ancient, terrible wisdom in her eyes. He realized then that the humans were not young. They were incredibly, tragically old. They were a species that had lived through their own apocalypse and come out the other side with a vow to never let it happen again. The hegemony will not kneel, Vakrul said, but the defiance was gone. We don't want you to kneel, Thorn replied, extending a hand. A gesture the Krail had learned was a human bond of honor. We want you to stand beside us. Vakrul looked at the hand. It was tiny compared to his claw. Slowly, with a reverence that surprised him, he reached out and took it. High Counselor Xyler watched the interaction from the security feed. He turned to the other members of the Synod, the Vex, the Oisir, the Lithos. The vote is unanimous, he asked. It is, the Oisir representative flowed, its colors shifting to a resolute blue. We accept the human proposal. The Galactic Defense Initiative is ratified. All fleets are to coordinate with Sol Command. They are frightening, the Vex clicked, but they are necessary. Xyler nodded. He looked back at the screen at the human ship floating in the void. It was ugly. It was brutal. It was magnificent. The humans had turned their history into a weapon and their trauma into a shield. They were the monsters who had decided to become guardians. And as the stars grew darker with the approaching shadow of the Typhon, Xyler realized that there was no one else he would rather have standing at the gate. The museum ship had done its job. It had taught the galaxy a lesson, not about the past, but about the future. The lesson was simple: do not go gentle into that good night. On the bridge of the Ozymandias, Elias Thorn watched the stars. He felt the ship groaning around him, the metal cooling, the systems dying. It was a good ship. It had served well. He patted the console. Rest now, old girl, he whispered. We'll take it from here. He walked to the airlock where his daughter was waiting. They had a war to plan, a war for existence, and for the first time in 1,000 years, humanity was not fighting for territory or resources or ideology. They were fighting for life itself, and they were bringing their friends. As the shuttle departed, leaving the silent, scarred hulk of the Ozymandias behind, the navigation lights of the station blinked in a rhythmic pattern. It was a Morse code signal, an ancient human language the Synod had just learned. It flashed HOP. The war had begun, but so had the unity. And in the darkness of the void, the united fleets of the galaxy began to gather, a wall of light against the encroaching night. The humans had opened the museum, and in doing so, they had saved the future. The cinematic view pulled back, leaving the station, leaving the system, accelerating until the galaxy was a spinning pinwheel of light in the infinite black. At the edge of that light, a red shadow pressed against the rim. But within the spiral, sparks of defiance were igniting. The forge was hot. The anvil was ready, and the hammer. Humanity was swinging down. The end,